So I wanted to talk about one of the Eightfold Path links and practices, and we can begin anywhere, but just as a reminder for us, there's liberatory understanding, liberatory thought, and then liberatory speech, liberatory ethics, and liberatory livelihood, and then effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And those are the 8 links. And I want to explore with you tonight's speech because it's so important. Really, it's like one of the most powerful tools that we have available to affect transformation within and without ourselves. And I do want to say up front that I've been working with a little nausea and a stomach ache this afternoon, and so we'll see how I do if I can be coherent. So we have talked about the expression of ignorance and the ways that insufficiency and inadequacy move us out to construct anchors, or we could say to construct a self, and that self is also a barrier to feeling the belonging in the family of life, and that the construction of the self is deep and pervasive. And so I wanted to tell you a story. Some of you have heard it before, but not all of you. I wanted to tell you a story about speech that was very impactful for me, well, for my family. So I went to visit my mother when she was living in London. My parents when they were living in London. And while I was there, she said, would I come and have lunch with this friend of hers? And so I said, sure. And his name was Raymond Eisenstein. He's since died. And we went to have lunch, and he talked nonstop, like just nonstop, like the whole lunch, just talked and talked and talked. And after I'd said, how can you bear it to just have this guy just talk the whole time? And she said, I've got a lot of time for Raymond. He was in the underground organization my parents were in South Africa, and had been imprisoned and tortured, and he never gave the names of any of the members. And she said, for that, it doesn't matter how much he talks, because that was so special. And from that came then this story that I wanted to let you know of why Raymond and my parents and so many activists were arrested. So I'm going to read you the story. It's public knowledge, and it was in Granta from the publication of new, but not always new, writers in England. And this is the only time I've seen Adrian Lefwich write about the experience. So it's a very long story, so I'm just going to take some particular parts of it. It was in the middle of a winter on July the 4th, 1964, that I was woken up by the security police at dawn. My girlfriend was in the flat at the time, and it was a sudden, threatening invasion. The raid turned out to be one of the many that were conducted across the country that morning. The security police had come to search for incriminating material which might connect me with any prescribed political organization or illegal political activity. About 2 years previously, I had been recruited into a small organization which came to be known as the African Resistance Movement, or ARM. I did not know everyone who was in it, as it was organized in a series of supposedly insulated regions and cells. Its main purpose was to sabotage public installations such as electricity pylons and cables as a means of protest against the apartheid regime. It was careful not to endanger human life. The cause was right, and politically it seemed to me to be the next inevitable step. Its activities provided an outlet for the frustration and hopelessness I had increasingly come to feel about conventional forms of resistance to the regime. But I now have the uneasy sense that perhaps it was my personal needs that found expression in those activities, needs that had only a tenuous relationship to the politics of the country. There was excitement in the secret danger of the work, and I was flattered to have been asked to join the organization. Maybe membership of it gave me a sense of self-importance, even of worth. It certainly served to ease the guilt that I'd come to feel about growing up white and privileged in South Africa. Perhaps in striving to be ever more radical, more daring, and more risk-taking, I was trying to appear superior to other young men with whom I felt myself to be in competition. So, I'll just read the story. Without really realizing what I was doing, I slipped into a kind of danger for which I was neither suited nor prepared. And then he was arrested and brought to the jail. Within 10 or 15 minutes, perhaps less, there was a thundering of feet on the stairs, and the security men were back. I was taken to the Central Police Station at Culloden Square and allowed to phone a lawyer, a privilege that was quite unusual for whites, and if not always for blacks, to tell him that I was going to be detained in solitary confinement under the 90-day law. So in South Africa, they had a new law that was passed, which said that anyone who appeared to be a danger to the South African Republic could be arrested without any judicial proceedings for 90 days and put in solitary, and then they would just keep renewing the 90 days. I had spent a weekend in the cells before, indeed in the very same cell on one occasion after being arrested on demonstrations, but this was different, and I can remember little now about the first 2 days, except I was swayed between hope and terror. The police wanted to know everything, and especially everyone involved. Rousseau, the head of security, waved the other security men out of his office, shoved me against a wall, and started to punch me in the stomach. He roughed me up with his fists, but it was nothing, absolutely nothing in comparison to what other people in South Africa and elsewhere had been subjected to at the hands of political police. Moments later, the other security men burst through the door, wanting or pretending to want to have a go as well, screaming at me. But they didn't touch me. I slid to the floor by the wall, more in shock than in pain. At that moment, I knew for certain that the roughing up would continue until I cracked. It was then that I started to talk. Over the following days and weeks, they played the good guy, bad guy routine in their interrogations, and I knew and yet did not know that they were doing it. Slowly but surely, I spilled the beans. I gave the names of colleagues who'd been members of the Cape Town wing of ARM, at first a few, hoping others would go on to ground and escape, and then a few more, and then more. And then he lists all the people that were part of this organization. And then I gave the name of my dearest friend, Hugh Lewin. I was to remain in solitary confinement for 5 months, but I was undone in those first 2 months, perhaps even the first 2 minutes of detention. Any remaining ability to resist the urge to do anything to get out of there, to crawl, to beg, to trade, dissolved that night. Whatever remaining determination I had to stand by my colleagues, whatever commitment I had to doing the right thing, and whatever fear I had of what people would say or think of me, just evaporated. Afterwards, I realized I'd learned something else that night. I learned that at the root of every fear I had ever had and every fear I would ever have was the impossible thought, the horror of my own extinction. That terminal terror was at the core of all my fear, and it has fed every fear I've had since, however unimportant, and each has seemed like a small reminder and expression of it. Today, when trivial things give me a fright or when I'm apprehensive about something relatively minor, I'm aware of how quickly and directly those fears connect me with that deeper and final fear. Many people in detention and under pressure make statements, and many can be made to talk. But I was to do worse. I gave evidence against my friends and colleagues at the trials of the Cape Town and Johannesburg groups. Some 8 or 9 members also agreed to give evidence, and a few of them went on to do so. But my responsibility for the face-to-face betrayal was by far the greatest. Having been at the center of the organization, the evidence I gave was the most damning. So then he goes, so then some of the people that I grew up with. Eddie Daniels was in for 15 years on Robben Island. Baruch Herson served 9 years. Hugh Lewin, 7. Raymond Eisenstein, that's the person that I quoted that my mom said she had time for. And anyway, this list of names of people in the organization. In the years that followed, it's unsurprising that apart from some family members and a few extraordinary friends, most South African radicals disowned and excommunicated me, one being my mother. She refused to ever talk to him again. But I've often wondered why we do not know how we will react. Is it because we do not know ourselves sufficiently well? Is that why we may sometimes act in a fog of self-ignorance and so get ourselves into situations which we should not be in and to which we turn out not to be equal to? I've come to think that not all of the choices we make are as rational as we might want them to be, especially the fateful ones. Perhaps they're more like lunges propelled by deeper currents of animal fear, survival, aggression, insecurity, hate, lust, hunger, which surface unpredictably and which can have the power to push aside all values, beliefs, morals, restraint, and self-dignity. I see now that part of my life I had been leading up until my arrest was a lie. Not a calculated lie, but a lie all the same. I must have had some awareness at the time about the tension between the kind of person I was and the kind of work I was doing, but I couldn't have understood it. The fact is that the outer shell of my image and behavior was false. It was a construction, a sustained act that arose out of the feeling of inadequacy, a fear of being small or unnoticed or unloved, and a corresponding need to impress people. I'm sure looking back that I got involved with political action because political action brought with it certainties and status that I felt I lacked. But by getting involved, I'd got into something that started to take on a life of its own. It took me further and further away from being able to understand my own limits or to accept them. The personal, social, and political life I built for myself, although apparently successful, had flimsy foundations. When I was really tested as the person I had constructed and played, the makeup melted away. This is like, isn't it amazing? It's exactly what we've been talking about in terms of ignorance and the ways it moves us out to construct selves and anchors. It's as though he was giving a Dharma discourse of ignorance. Why did I come to feel responsible for all that was going on in South Africa and seek to change it without first taking responsibility for myself? Was this not my real crime, my original one, the crime of self-ignorance? And did my other crimes not follow directly from that? I can't really answer this question. This line of thinking, though, might help to explain the way I behaved as I did. Perhaps it only raises more questions than it answers. And perhaps it's enough, quite simply, morally and politically, to know that my behavior was harmful and wrong. So I'm just going on to another section. When dealing with a rotten tooth or a suppurating wound, you must first find and clear out the muck before healing can commence. Otherwise it will spread, and you must be willing to look at that muck. And this is how he ends. There are still times when I feel waves of self-disgust and shame as well that well up uncontrollably, and I feel they will drown me. The sense of hopelessness returns and I want to run and hide. But I have come to believe not only that it's possible to go on and to keep going, but that we should and we must. There is simply no other way to be. To remember and take responsibility for the past in order to live in the present and contribute to the future, to learn from that past so as never to be like that again, and then to pass on the teachings. So I think it's sort of obvious to name the power of our words for bringing about harm or bringing about healing, and the power of Adrian's words that really affected the anti-apartheid movement because so many people were imprisoned. And not to focus on him individually so much as to lift up the dangers of what happens when we aren't truthful and honest with ourselves, and how when we get into situations where that dishonesty becomes the incapacity to speak or to act with integrity. And for me, I feel so passionate about the integration of the work we're doing, that turning towards ourselves and healing ourselves, so that when we move out in different ways, whether it's in our intimate family relationships, organizationally, here at the center, we are more in touch with ourselves and therefore more able to discern what's skillful and what isn't skillful. And how can we, and this is why I love that writing so much, because he's really saying, how can we build revolutionary movements if we're acting out of the constructed and offended self? And it's such an incredible teaching. And it's so funny, you know, in a way that, I mean, I understand why my mother couldn't forgive him. And my father did, but not my mother, because it was so impactful, so intensely painful and impactful. And yet, it lifts up the dynamic in all of us. And actually the dynamic in my father, because some of you have heard the stories I've told about my father. So this constantly linking and looking at the linking of what it means to have general comprehension and mindfulness of what we're doing, and the impact of when we don't have that. Yeah. So, and around speech, it's so interesting because the Buddha was emphatic about a lot of things. Particularly, he was emphatic about speech. And he said this. He said, so little, he's talking to his son. It's really kind of sweet for those of you who don't know. After a number of years of teaching, the Buddha went back home again, and that's where he met his son, who was 12 at the time of his visit. And he gave some teachings when he was home, and his son said, I really want to come with you. I really want to come back with you. And the Buddha said, you're too young. And Rahula asked a second time and then a third time. And so the Buddha said, okay. And so he took Rahula back to the Sangha. And so then there are all these special teachings of the Buddha to his son. And so little, Rahula, is the spiritual achievement of one who is not afraid to tell a lie. Then the Buddha threw away water that he had in a bowl and said, in the same way, one who tells the deliberate lie throws away whatever spiritual achievement they make. Do you see now how this bowl is empty? In the same way, one who has no hesitation about speaking lies is empty of spiritual achievement. And this actually reminds me of Werner Erhard, who began EST trainings. And do you remember? He said that his spiritual awakening came from a commitment he made. He said, for a year, I commit to not ever telling a lie, to only speaking the truth. And he said that commitment lifted up for him so much of his own constructed behaviors that he was forced to acknowledge and to heal that in that process he had a deep awakening experience, and out of that came Est, which now is something else. I think it's a different name. So so then the Buddha goes on to be very specific about what we should refrain from, and he says we should refrain from false speech, slanderous speech, harsh speech, and idle chatter. So abstaining from false speech. I mean, it's so why do we lie? You know, why? What are the motivations for lying? So, well, one we know is the lies that corporations tell in order to sustain their profits. We've just heard about Facebook not sharing the information that they knew years ago about the negative impacts of Instagram, or that Firestone had for years and years known there was something wrong in the manufacture of some of their tires, and not owning up to it until the Consumer Protection Agency took them to court after quite a number of people died. And we could go on and on. Ford trucks exploding, and so I think over 100 people died before Ford actually acknowledged accountability for it. And I just heard that Boeing finally accepted responsibility for the death of the second crash of one of their Boeing 747s, you know, after denying and saying it was the pilot's fault. So why do we lie? For greed. And then why do we lie? Because we feel like whatever is the truth isn't good enough. So we have to look better. I remember early on in my teaching career, Sharon Salzberg, I was teaching a retreat up in Maine, and Sharon Salzberg said, "How many people were you there?" And there were 25, but I said, "Oh, 35," because that seemed like a bigger amount, a more impressive amount. Why do we lie? Sometimes it's just compulsive. That, you know, sometimes it's like it feels like it's impossible to tell the truth. And then sometimes we lie for the sake of a joke, you know, or a story. Like, we love to tell stories, and so we'll exaggerate the story. Or sometimes we lie to protect people or to protect ourselves from accountability. Sometimes lies are the only defense we have available. So we lie for many reasons. And in saying this, it's clear that by lying, we actually continue the veil of obstructions between ourselves and our hearts, and we repress the liberating capacity of truthfulness and honesty to liberate the heart and mind. It's I can see why the Buddha said, if you lie, you're throwing out all your spiritual attainment, because you're actually turning away from what's real. And if you're turning away from what's real, you can't be accountable. You can't heal. And then, of course, you know, I mean, then just taking Adrian Lefwich's example, but then just really acknowledging together how intense it is, the lies about the election, and how that has become the grounds for all the changes in districting that have excluded voting rights for particularly African Americans, BIPOC communities. So lies are very profound and all originate from this misunderstanding of where happiness lies, where happiness is. So then slanderous speech, speech which divides, which creates dissension and enemies, that might come through jealousy, envy, intentionally wanting to belittle and harm, winning affection by playing up others' faults, a delight in seeing friends divided. And that's like, that is so much part of our current political climate, but also amongst our youth. What's happening online with youth and what they're saying to each other, like really being slanderous. So slanderous speech, and it's, you know, just profoundly harmful. And then idle chatter, pointless talk, speech which lacks purpose or depth, speech which communicates nothing or stirs up the defilements. I do want to say, in regards to idle chatter, that I think that there's definitely a space and time for idle chatter. Like when I, you know, see anyone in the post office that I know, you know, we'll talk about the weather, or we'll talk about, if I know they love sports. When I lived in Massachusetts, there were two subjects that everyone loved to talk about: the Boston Red Sox and the weather. And you might actually name that as idle chatter, but it was really connecting with people and building up relationships, right? Finding the gateway to build up relationships. So not idle chatter. And then, you know, and then other things too, like reminding someone of their previous misdeeds. Have you ever had a fight with someone and you're fighting about one thing and they say, oh yeah, and you did this, 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 and this, when you already had talked about it and resolved it, but then they bring it up again, right? That is called unliberating, or speaking that doesn't bring liberation. The other, speaking well of someone when others have had a hard time with them through their misdeeds. Like, you know, oh, they're not so bad. Have you had that experience when you're talking and it's like your whole reality is denied because they're like being protective, like, oh, they're not so bad. And it's like believing badly of someone when they're the silent third party. Exaggerating, not appreciating others, ridiculing others, being friendly and then saying negative things behind their back, flattering someone in power instead of speaking out around abuse, not giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Like, I think that is huge, not giving someone the benefit of the doubt. So much negativity happens when you don't know for sure and you go to what's wrong. Embarrassing someone. So those are some others. And then I wanted to, let's see. So this is framing it in a slightly different way. So because practitioners, there are these 5 modes of speech that others may use when they address you. Their speech may be timely or untimely, true or untrue, gentle or harsh, for good or for harm, and may be accompanied by thoughts of loving kindness or by hate. Now this is how you should train yourself. Our minds will remain unaffected. We shall utter no bad words. We shall abide friendly and compassionate, with thoughts of loving kindness and no inner hate. We shall abide with loving kindness in our hearts, extending to that person, and we shall dwell extending it to the entire world as our object, with our hearts abundant, exalted, measureless in loving kindness, without hostility or ill will. That is how you should train yourselves. Wow, what an amazing vision. I deeply aspire to this vision of no matter what people are saying, I abide in loving kindness, measureless, without hostility or ill will. That's so beautiful. No matter what people say. So I then wanted to tell a different type of story. And this is a story about Lawrence Anthony in the Thula Thula Private Game Reserve in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, which is in the kind of middle of South Africa. And he was called an elephant whisperer because he had a particular capacity to connect with elephants. And there'd been this raging family of elephants that were trampling crops and destroying homes. And partly because the elder mother elephant had been murdered. And they had seen the murder, the whole family. I don't know if that's what you call elephants together, a family or not. And so it seemed like the game wardens, they felt like they had no option but to kill them. And then someone said, well, let's give the elephants one more chance. Let's actually fly them to this game reserve with the elephant whisperer. So they managed to shoot tranquilizing darts into the elephants and actually flew them on a plane, transported them to this game reserve. And they were finally let out into a pen that Lawrence had constructed, which had electrical wiring all around it. And as soon as the tranquilizers wore off, the lead elephant, which was a female elephant, sort of walked around, and then in front of Lawrence, she picked up one of the huge stakes that the electrical wire was around, and even though she was being shocked, lifted up, smashed it down, and all the elephants went away. They all escaped. So Lawrence rounded them up again, thinking that let's try again. At the 3rd time, it was like, if they do this again, then we have to kill them. So this is what he said. He wrote a biography. Anthony found himself fighting a desperate battle for their survival and trust. It was 4:45 a.m. and I was standing in front of Nana, an enraged wild elephant, pleading with her in desperation. Both our lives depended on it. The only thing separating us was an 8,000-volt electrical fence that she was preparing to flatten and make her escape again. Nana, the matriarch of the herd, tensed her enormous frame and flared her ears. "Don't do it, Nana," I said as calmly as I could. She stood there motionless but tense. The rest of the herd froze. "This is your home now. Please don't do it, girl." I felt her eyes boring into me. "They'll kill you if you break out. This is your home now. You have no need to run anymore." Suddenly, the absurdity of the situation struck me. Here I was in a pitch black darkness, talking to this wild female elephant with a baby, the most dangerous possible combination, as if we were having a friendly chat. But I meant every word. "You will die if you go. Stay here. I will be here with you, and it's a good place." She took another step forward. I could see her tense up again, preparing to snap the electrical wire and be out, the rest of the herd smashing after her in a flash. I was in their path, and would only have seconds to scramble out of their way and climb the nearest tree. I wondered if I would be fast enough to avoid being trampled. Possibly not. Then something happened between Nana and me, some tiny spark of recognition, flaring for the briefest of moments. Then it was gone. Nana turned and melted back into the enclosure. The rest of the herd followed. I couldn't explain what happened between us, but it gave me the first glimmer of hope since the elephants had first thundered into my life. So his energy and those words were the beginning of a long relationship with this herd. And when a number of years later he had a heart attack, they'd been released from the enclosure after a number of years. And when he had a heart attack, somehow this herd of elephants knew and walked 3 days to where he lived and stayed around his house where he had died, mourning for him. So the incredible power of that love and love expressed in words. And you know, for me it's such a beautiful reminder of, even though we might not think it, of the power of our own words of love. Just how even when we think it isn't going to land, it does land and it does make a difference. And then I wanted to offer, as a way to support this transformation from speech that harms to speech that doesn't harm, and lift up non-violent communication, and offer just a couple of examples of it. I'm not going to go any more deeply to it other than to just give you a small taste of a practice that has helped me enormously in terms of refraining from harming through my speech. So here are a couple of examples of well, I'll let you decide. Okay. So some different forms of communication. Your dog just made a mess on my lawn. Yelling obscenities isn't going to get you what you want. By putting your money in mutual funds, you're just supporting guns and tobacco and sweatshops and all the things we're trying to change in the world. This soup has too many calories. At this Sangha, we require teamwork. If that's not a priority for you, you better look for another one. Hey, kids, flashlights aren't toys. Don't waste batteries. They cost money. This is to our children, this is to children. Where in the world do you think you're going in the middle of a school day? You told me 2 weeks ago would be fine if I were to take a long weekend this month. That's not nonviolent communication, what you just said. Here's some different options. So this is for, your dog just made a mess on my lawn. When I see your dog leaving turds on the lawn, I feel upset. We have kids who play here, and I need the yard to be a safe and clean space for them. Would you be willing to use this plastic bag to remove the turds? Turds, yeah. So then yelling obscenities isn't going to get you what you want. When I hear you addressing me like that, I feel agitated because I need cooperation and peaceful resolution of our differences. Are you willing to tell me what you're feeling and needing right now instead of what you think I am? When I hear you have put money in mutual funds, I feel dejected because I'd like to see us put our resources into what we value rather than to support guns, tobacco, and sweatshops. Would you be willing to tell me what you're feeling when you hear me say this? I'm worried about the calories in the soup because I really need to take care of my health. Would you be willing to give me a bowl of noodles instead? When I read this report you wrote, I feel troubled because I value teamwork, and I need some reassurance that we're on the same page. Would you be willing to make an appointment so we can discuss how we each see the priorities? When I see you kids playing with the flashlight under the blanket, I feel uneasy. I want these flashlights to last so they'll be available if we have an emergency. Would you be willing to put them away? When I see you walking out of school in the middle of the day, I feel alarmed. I need some understanding here. Are you willing to explain to me where you're heading? Pretty amazing difference, isn't it? I love nonviolent communication. I just think it's amazing. It's just so radical, transforming judgment, shaming, and blaming into talking about what our needs are and offering options. Just so radical and beautiful. Okay. So there are several books on non-violent communication if you're interested. And then finally, talking about words and the healing power of words. This is Najama by Arinna Weisman. Just a couple of poems to end with. We are the remembering. We have been light centuries away from ourselves, but now we are returning. Yes, by love, we are returning. It's another poem. Do not choose the lesser life. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Choose the life that is yours, the life that is seducing your lungs and dripping down your chin. So let's sit for a moment. Thank you for your listening and presence. So we'll take a short break and come back for equanimity practice.